desks, credenzas, coffee tables, dressers. Something that so many pieces of furniture share in common is that they're based around the ability to build a good box. So today we're going to cover everything that you should know about boxes from A to Z, and I'm going to walk you through my process for building them on 4S. All right, so this is a big topic, and it's inevitable that I'm gonna miss something that you would have liked to see me talk about. So I'm just gonna base it off of my experiences and my thoughts, and because of that, it's probably gonna be slightly biased towards modern or minimalist furniture since that's predominantly what I build. That said, I think that a good place to start is with joinery, and again here, there's more types of joints than I could ever possibly name, but I think that about 99% of them are kind of just some variation off of the 5 that I am going to talk about, and those would be butt joints, rabbet joints, mitered joints, box joints, and dovetails. So my first tip would be this. Pick the types of joints that speak to you and focus primarily on those. For me, that happens to be mitered joints and rabbet joints, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try making dovetails or that dovetails can't be your go-to joint. Again, just pick what'll work best towards your end goal and focus on that. So I'm probably not going to get deep into dovetails. That said, if you want a great resource for all things dovetail, check out Jonathan Katz-Moses' channel. He's got a ton of videos and tips and tricks that deep dive into that world, so I'll link one below. Okay, so as it pertains to modern or minimalist furniture, I would say that the king of all box types is the mitered box. And there are a few different reasons for that. But I would say that the biggest two are it's the best or most seamless for whenever you want to have that look where the grain is wrapping around the edge of a box. And the second would be that if you're using plywood and you want to cover up the plywood edges, you're going to only have to worry about 4 edges as opposed to 8 that you'd have to cover up if it were butt joints or rabbet joints, not counting the back edges, of course. So I guess that kind of leads into what is probably the biggest question for when it comes to building boxes for furniture, and that is hardwood or plywood. So rather than talking about it in theory, why don't we just get into building some boxes, and rather than telling you what you should pick, I'm going to go through the process of building a pair of identical boxes, one out of plywood and one out of hardwood, and hopefully this will be something that you can think back on as you make your decisions from project to project. And I'll try my best to point out some of the key factors that can help you make those decisions. So starting with hardwood, one of the biggest and most obvious drawbacks is that it requires a decent amount of work just to get to what is kind of the starting point with plywood, and that would be making some panels. So one of the first deciding factors might be, do you have a joiner and or a planer? And if not, do you have access to pre-milled lumber? If the answer to both of those is no, plywood might be the way to go. But if you do, making nice panels is pretty integral to making a nice box. So I'm not going to deep dive into that process, but essentially you would have to joint your material flat, plane it to an even thickness, joint one edge, cut the other edge square and parallel, and then glue up some panels. And after doing all of that, you'd be ready to start making your box. Now with plywood, obviously it's quite a bit less work, but you still have to examine your sheets to make sure that you're getting your show faces from the best part of the wood. And actually, let's quickly talk about the box that I'm going to be building here, just because I think that that'll help to see it in the context of the larger project. So this box is part of a desk that I'm currently building for a set of plans. Now the desk itself has a few options, the main one being to build it where the box is attached to one of the legs, or to build it where the box is separate. Another big variable with the desk is that you can opt to build it where it'll sit up against a wall or where it can be in the middle of a room, which means that it needs to look good from both sides. So that means that the box also needs to look good from both sides. So on the front side, where a person would sit, the box is going to get 3 drawers. And then on the back side, which might face a doorway where a person could enter the room, there's going to be some adjustable shelving where you could display some objects. Okay, that's probably enough context. That said, if you want more information about the full video plans, I'll have a link to our website in the description. So back to the plywood, if you're going to want that wraparound grain look, you're going to want to think about where your panels are coming from. In this drawing here, the dimensions aren't really important, but what's more important are the labels on the bottom that illustrate which piece will become the top, right, left, and bottom to achieve that look. Now, if you're doing this with hardwood and you want that wraparound look also, you're gonna have to kind of do the same thing. So you could either glue up a large panel that you then split into smaller panels, or glue up a bunch of individual panels, keeping track of which pieces will go where during the glue up phase. Okay, regardless of which way you decide to go, at this point you should have 4 oversized panels and you can start cutting bevels in order to make your mitered box. So if you're using hardwood, you'd set your blade to 45 degrees and cut a bevel onto one edge of each of your 4 panels, then measure and mark out your desired length and cut the other side. Personally, I like to make the second cut in 2 passes. First leaving the panel about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch long, and then making a light pass to finalize it. If you're using plywood, a good trick is to set your blade just barely past 45 degrees, so just like 1/10 of a degree. And the reason for this is if there's any error and you're not going to be dead on 45 degrees, especially with plywood, you'd rather be slightly past 45 degrees as opposed to slightly shy of it. And what that'll do is cause the gaps to be on the inside of the miters rather than on the outside. And here's an extreme illustration where we're setting the blade to 5 degrees off instead of just 0.1 degrees, and you can kind of see what's happening. Having said that, the process for cutting the bevels is exactly the same on plywood, where we're going to cut one edge and then take 2 passes to finalize the length of the panels. Okay, so whenever we initially made our panels, they were both too wide and too long. And when we cut the bevels just now, we finalized their length. But I think it's best to wait until after that to finalize their width. And the reason for that is that you might get tear out, especially on plywood. And if you do, it's most likely going to happen while you're cross-cutting. So the next step would be to set your fence to your desired width and then rip all of your panels with your blade set to 90 degrees. Okay, so there's only a few more things that are specific to building your box out of hardwood versus plywood. So I want to talk about those now, and that means that we're going to get a little bit out of order here. And then after we do that, we'll talk more about things that have to do with just building boxes in general, regardless of the material. So the first of those things would be how to handle the front edges. For example, on the desk, one of the repeating themes are these chamfered or beveled edges. The top has them, the drawer faces have them, and the box is going to get them on the front and back sides as well. That said, there's all sorts of different edge details that you could possibly want to put on your box, and when it comes to plywood, there's 2 ways you can do it, and that's putting your hardwood edging on before the glue up or after the glue up. So if you decide to do them towards the beginning before the glue up, we would have to back up to when our panels were oversized and before we had cut the bevels. And what we would have done is glued on some hardwood edging at this point. And in this case, it would have been a 1 inch by 3/4 of an inch strip of hardwood on the front and back edges of each piece. Then we would have sanded or routed them flush with the plywood faces, and then we could have started the process of cutting our bevels. In other words, had we done that, we'd be exactly where we are with the hardwood version right now. And for the detail that we want on this box, we'd measure it out on one piece and then cut it along each edge of each panel. And then we could move on to the glue up. So personally speaking, I prefer to do the hardwood edging before glue up method when I'm using really thin strips just to cover plywood edges. But if I'm doing something like this, where it's more of a design detail, I prefer to attach it after, which I'll demonstrate after we glue up the box. But just to tease it, the reason that I prefer to do it that way is it's kind of a safety net or an insurance policy. And speaking of insurance policies, let's thank Policy Genius for sponsoring today's video. So if you've never heard of them, Policy Genius simplifies the process of buying life, home, and auto insurance policies and more. Now, I've bought life insurance the traditional way, twice actually. And trust me, it can be a pain. But thankfully, Policy Genius does most of the work for you. So the way it works is you head over to policygenius.com/4eyes, enter your information and what kind of coverage you're looking for, and Policy Genius will compare quotes and find the coverage that's best for you at the best possible price. In fact, with Policy Genius, you can save up to 40% just by comparing quotes. I actually went through the process to compare it to my existing policy from a few years back, and well, let's just say that I could have done better. So once you've applied, the Policy Genius team will handle the process from there. And you don't have to worry about dodgy sales pitches or anything like that. Just unbiased advice from their licensed experts. And that's because Policy Genius is an independent broker, so they fight for the customer, not the insurance company. And that's important because choosing the wrong life insurance company now could cost you $47,000 over the course of a 30-year policy. $47,000, that's like 47,000 items off of a dollar menu. Actually, I did the math, and if you're eating almost 4.5 cheeseburgers a day, you're definitely gonna want life insurance. So visit policygenius.com/4eyes to shop the market and start saving today. Like I said, they also offer home and auto insurance, and Policy Genius has saved their home and auto insurance customers an average of $1,127 per year. That's like... just check them out. Okay, thanks Policy Genius. Okay, so either way, before you glue up, there might be a few more specifics that need to get taken care of. In our example, we'd need to cut a dado for the center panel and some adjustable shelving holes. Cutting the holes is pretty universal, so it doesn't really matter if you're using plywood or hardwood, and cutting the dados for a box like this is pretty universal as well. That said, cutting the center panel that'll go in the dados isn't. Well, not completely at least. In either situation, you'll figure out how big your center panel is by measuring your horizontal and vertical distances from the inside of the bevel to the inside of the other bevel, and then adding the depth of your dado times 2 since there's one on each side. So let's say that the measurements were 17 and 24 inches, and your dados were 1/4 inch deep. Well, you know that your distances were 17.5 inches and 24.5 inches. So technically, out of plywood, you could cut your center panel exactly that big and you'd be ready to glue up. That said, I wouldn't. I'd cut it slightly undersized so that it doesn't get in the way during the glue up, and that would be that. With hardwood though, you definitely want to make your panel a little bit undersized, especially across the width, as it could potentially expand, and if it doesn't have any room to expand within the dados, it might cause the joints to break apart. So with hardwood, I'd back it off by about 1/4 inch across the width, and then maybe 1/8 inch across the length. Okay, gluing up. This is another part where there's countless options and ways that you can go, and again, I can't possibly cover them all, but the most simplistic version would be the tape method. Basically, what you do is line your pieces up edge to edge and face down in the position that you want them, put a bunch of tape on the seams, flip them back over and put some glue in, and then just kind of fold it all up. And you might be thinking that this is going to make for a weak joint, but trust me, it'll be strong if you do it right. I've done this on boxes that are significantly bigger than this one, which carried a lot more weight, and it's not a problem. And actually, if you did want to make it this way and then add some reinforcement after the fact, you could wait for it to dry, install some dowels, and that would work. You could also cut in some splines, and honestly, there's a lot of different routes you could go, including using everybody's favorite tool, the domino. If you do though, what I would suggest is to cut one side of each mortise to fit the domino and the other side of the mortise wider. That'll make it easier to get everything together and just give you some wiggle room to make sure that the edges of your panel line up when you're gluing. And honestly, in my opinion, the benefit of the domino doesn't really have anything to do with strength. And to me, really the benefits are, 1, it's kind of an extra set of hands to hold things in position while you're gluing up large panels. 2, it helps with alignment. And 3, it gives a physical reinforcement for before the glue has dried that allows you to use a lot more clamping force to close up any gaps, pull things square, and so forth. Something else to mention about gluing boxes together, and this is regardless of what type of joinery or material you're using, is that getting square or 90-degree corners is kind of the whole game, I guess. And this becomes increasingly important if you're going to be adding in drawer boxes and doors and you're trying to get those nice even gaps. So if you feel like you're constantly off, there are a lot of various jigs on the market. I have these clamp it squares from Rockler and also these clamping squares from Woodpeckers, and these can both help quite a bit. They aren't going to make every joint always perfect 90 degrees, but they can definitely get you closer and allow you to add pressure in directions that would otherwise be difficult. And also, not unlike the domino, both kind of act as extra sets of hands for putting large panels together. Okay, so for fun, we decided to test what it would take to break this box, which doesn't have any reinforcements. It's just bevel cuts that were glued and taped together, no clamps, and granted this is pretty unscientific, but here it is with about 300 pounds of wood and 150 pounds of Sean on top of it. no problems there. And here we tried hitting it with a dead blow hammer along a face. And here with all of the force focused on an edge. And again, no problem. To get it to break, we ended up tossing it in the air a few times, and finally it broke along the joint line, taking some wood with it. Bottom line is, it's pretty strong. Also, generally, if you're building a large piece of furniture that's going to have a lot of weight on top of it, there's a good chance that you're going to have one or more vertical partitions in it, and really that's going to carry most of the weight and transfer it down into whatever your base structure is. Okay, now let's jump back into the whole hardwood edging on a plywood box thing, and we already covered how you could do it before the glue up, but like I said, you could also do it after the glue up, so let's take care of that now. So the biggest benefit, in my opinion, for doing it this way is that any gaps that are in the plywood edges of your box are going to be independent from any gaps that are in the hardwood edging of your box. So remember we erred on the side of cutting our bevels so that if there was any gap, it was on the inside of the miter. Well, if we had successfully done that, then the only place it would be noticeable would be on the front edge of the plywood. And now we have the opportunity to hide it. That said, it can be a fairly tedious process as you have to work your way around each piece, fitting them all in perfectly. And I guess the biggest tip I can give here is make your strips slightly thicker than your plywood, and then aim for having them flush with the inside of your cabinet and proud on the outside. That way you can route or sand them flush afterwards. If you have them proud on the inside, it can be hard to get to them, and you'll have to use a chisel to make them look nice. Okay, so that pretty much takes care of building the two boxes. So I guess finally, I'd like to leave you with a few more thoughts and opinions to help you decide. So if nothing else, I hope that I've at least illustrated that either plywood or hardwood is a viable option and both will work. That said, I think one of the key factors that people will use in helping them decide is cost. And most people would also probably assume that the cost of plywood is cheaper. And what I would say is that sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. Now, obviously, the species that you're using is going to play a factor in that, but another factor that you might not consider is size. For example, the box that I built for this project is roughly 20 board feet, and it's made of beech, which costs about $3 per board foot. So that's about $60 in material. But for most species of plywood, you can't buy it in less than a full sheet, which for furniture grade material costs about $80 to $110. So basically, the smaller the box is, the more likely it is that hardwood is actually the cheaper option, and the bigger you get, the more likely it is that plywood becomes the cheaper option. Another factor that you should think about is durability. And by durability, I don't mean strength. I think that we've seen that plywood is plenty strong, but rather more how it'll hold up to everyday use. So one area where hardwood is going to have an advantage is that it's pretty much homogeneous all the way through, whereas with plywood you have a thin veneer that if you ever sand through that, you're kind of screwed. So if you can imagine the piece that you're building is going to take a fair amount of abuse and possibly need to be refinished every once in a while, hardwood. Also, still sticking on the topic of durability, another thing to consider is how durable it'll actually be in the shop while you're working on it. So that's not to say that I drop kick my hardwood pieces into place and throw them around, but it does add a little peace of mind knowing that, I can set it down a little bit more hard or spin it around and not have to worry as much about getting a little scratch in it or nicking a corner or whatever. It's just a lot more durable and easy to fix any little shop accidents that might happen. Okay, so another factor to consider is thickness, and that's from both a construction and an aesthetic point of view. So with hardwood, you're going to be able to get whatever thickness of lumber you want and mill it to whatever thickness you want. But with plywood, obviously you're going to be stuck with whatever thickening are available to you. That said, there are workarounds, being able to build face frames and so forth, and it's not that big of a deal, but still something to think about. And the last big consideration would be wood movement. So with hardwood, it's going to be more likely to move than plywood is. And in general, I don't think wood movement is that big of a factor. I think most people's consideration for wood movement is drastically blown out of proportion. That said, hardwood will move a little bit, and depending on how you're using it, it could present problems, whereas plywood is pretty much not going to move at all. So here's an example of how that can affect a project. Take something like this dresser. Full plans are also available on the website, by the way, link in the description. Anyway, it's made from hardwood, so to attach the base to the cabinet, we use these figure-8 desktop fasteners, which will allow for the wood to move. But if this were made from plywood, you could pretty much just screw it right through the underside of the apron and into the cabinet, and it would be fine. Again, not saying that it's a huge deal, just something to consider. Okay, so doing this little side-by-side comparison, I don't know if it made it sound like I was biased towards hardwood. I'm definitely not, but I kind of felt that way as I was saying it. So I don't know what the truth is. Maybe it's that hardwood is a little bit better than plywood in a lot of little ways, whereas maybe plywood is just a little bit better or a lot better than hardwood, only in fewer ways. I don't know. I mean, the point of the video is not to tell you what you should pick for every situation, but rather just to give you some information and some things that you can think about for when you're faced with those decisions to help make it not such a hard one. Not make the decision such a hard one. I'm not biased.